Steel bows knifing through the waves as they speed into harm's way, the destroyers are among the fastest and most deadly warships ever built. Mounting a powerful arsenal of offensive and defensive weapons, they can serve equally well as escorts for other vessels or as formidable attack ships in their own right. From their humble beginnings as stripped-down vessels designed exclusively to destroy torpedo boats, through the World War II models battling packs of German U-boats in the North Atlantic, to the most modern versions that are capable of striking targets dozens of miles away with advanced anti-aircraft missiles. The evolution of the destroyer has been marked by a constant expansion of its combat capabilities. Yet in all its sizes and shapes, its basic qualities have remained the same. Speed and power combined in a compact ship that is capable of fulfilling a number of roles. Throughout their history, no warship has been able to match the accomplishments, the style, or the sheer dash of the destroyers. They've served in navies great and small as fleet guards, anti-aircraft ships, sub-killers, mine layers, mine sweepers, and troop transports, and participated in virtually every naval battle of this century. Though they first took to sea over 100 years ago, their story is far from over. Indeed, the destroyers are still thriving to this day. Perhaps no ships demonstrate the exceptional qualities of the destroyer more fully than those of the Arleigh Burke class. Named after the most legendary destroyer commander in the history of the U.S. Navy, they are the end product of a century of design improvements. First built in the mid-1980s, these remarkable vessels weigh 8,400 tons, are 466 feet long, and are equipped with a dazzling array of guns, missiles, and sensors. They carry crews of 337 men and women, and their 4 gas turbines can drive their rakish hulls through the water at top speeds of well over 30 knots. They also incorporate several stealth technologies that make them practically invisible on radar.
We recently did an exercise where we sailed through the whole fleet without being detected. We turned off our navigation lights and all our radars, and we sailed through the entire fleet, and often they won't see an Arleigh Burke destroyer until they see it through their binoculars.
Taken in total, these features make the Arleigh Burkes the most sophisticated and powerful destroyers ever built. Considering who they were named after, that could hardly be more appropriate. Nicknamed 31-knot Burke because of his hard-charging style, Arleigh Burke had a long and distinguished career in the U.S. Navy, rising to overall command of the service during some of the darkest days of the Cold War. But he made his reputation during World War II as the commander of Destroyer Squadron 23, the legendary Little Beavers, which was made up of powerful Fletcher-class destroyers. Operating in the South Pacific Solomon Islands, Burke's squadron of Fletchers helped derail the so-called Tokyo Express, a series of missions by Japanese destroyers and other ships aimed at resupplying their troops on the island of Guadalcanal. As the Arleigh Burkes are the ultimate destroyers of our time, so the Fletchers were of World War II. But destroyers first took to the water long before that. They were built in response to a vessel that threatened to revolutionize naval warfare. In 1870, the British launched the HMS Lightning. Though small, she carried a weapon that made her a significant danger to the largest warships afloat, the torpedo. Developed in the 1860s by a British engineer named Robert Whitehead, the torpedo was a self-propelled underwater projectile which carried a powerful warhead that could blow a hole in the side of even the most heavily armored battleship. Placed on a swift vessel like the Lightning, the torpedo posed a serious danger to the larger warships that had ruled naval combat for centuries. The torpedo boat was born.
The torpedo boat came about because of the development of the self-propelled torpedo and the need to have a vehicle to carry it. It wasn't a long-range weapon. You needed to get in close with it to launch it. You didn't want to have to spend a lot of time getting in close because the other guy'd be shooting at you.
Other nations quickly copied the Lightning. Ironically, nowhere were the repercussions felt more strongly than among the commanders of the British Navy. With a huge fleet of battleships, the British were threatened more than any other naval power by the spread of their own invention.
What's special about a torpedo is that you have a device which can sink the larger ship, but which can be fired from a very small ship, a very cheap ship. So all of a sudden, a country which can't afford, say, battleships, can buy an equalizer. The British Navy turns up off your coast with 20 battleships to destroy your city. You send out your heroes in torpedo boats, they sink a couple of battleships, and they're all gone.
Faced with this new naval menace, the British came up with an obvious solution: build a vessel to protect the battleships, one that was just as fast as the torpedo boats, but which carried more firepower. Its official name was the Torpedo Boat Destroyer, but to almost everyone, the new vessels were soon known simply as destroyers.
The problem for the British is that when the torpedo boats dart out, they're a very fleeting target. Whatever sinks them has to keep up with them. It occurs to the British, if they build something sort of like a torpedo boat, but a lot bigger, with guns, with a serious gun armament, it can hunt down torpedo boats and destroy them.
In 1892, Admiral Sir John "Jackie" Fisher asked the naval designers at Yarrow Shipyard to build the first of these ships. 2 years later, the torpedo boat destroyer HMS Havoc was launched. Displacing only 275 tons, the Havoc was powered by locomotive boilers that could propel her through the water at 26 knots. She carried 4 guns and 3 torpedo tubes of her own, making her effectively a larger and more heavily armed torpedo boat. However, the destroyer was more than just a weapons platform. It was a ship, but a small ship, and one that was tough on its crews.
Life aboard a Victorian age destroyer was miserable. They were small, they were narrow, they could be fast, they were low to the water, which meant with any kind of a sea running, they were very wet. They rocked, they rolled, they yawed, so you were in constant motion in 3 dimensions.
The Royal Navy came up with the idea of hard-lying money, an extra pay allowance for difficult conditions, to get officers to volunteer for destroyer duty. Gradually, however, life on board the destroyers improved. So did their performance. But they were still inefficient and relatively slow compared to the speedy torpedo boats. Then, in 1897, at Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee Fleet Review, a new type of ship appeared, the yacht Turbina. Propelled by the recently developed Parsons steam turbine, she sped up and down the lines of warships faster than any destroyer. Quickly seeing the potential of the new engine, the Royal Navy began building turbine-driven destroyers.
The main point about a turbine is that it spins very evenly. The previous engine was a piston engine. You make a piston engine go faster and faster, it vibrates harder and harder. First of all, if you have a small, lightweight hull, that means it'll rip it up much faster. If it's a heavier hull, then the machine will fall apart faster. So the main point about a turbine was that it was smooth. You would kill the vibration.
With its speed and other capabilities increasing, the destroyer, originally considered a strictly defensive weapon to protect the battleships of the main battle fleet while they were in port or sheltered coastal waters, was gaining the capabilities to make it a potential offensive threat. Within a few years, Admiral Jackie Fisher would once again take an interest in the development of these swift, waterborne warriors. The results would have far-reaching effects on the future of the destroyers. Speed and power were Jackie Fisher's gods. Though best known as the father of the massive Dreadnought-class battleship, he was also a champion of the speedy, hard-hitting destroyer. While commanding the Royal Navy, he issued a directive for a new class of torpedo boat destroyers in November of 1904. But his maniacal emphasis on speed and gunfire had led to a serious neglect in another critical element of warship design: strength of construction. The result was the Tribal class of destroyers, flimsily constructed vessels with miserable fuel economy. Even though the Tribal class were roundly criticized by other naval officers, Fisher was undeterred. His next brainstorm was the Swift, an oversized destroyer leader, which Fisher claimed would make 39 knots and lead squadrons of destroyers into combat side by side with the main battle fleet. It barely reached 35 knots. Despite the flaws in his designs, by the time Fisher departed the Admiralty in 1908, his central theory had taken root. Destroyers were not there just to defend against torpedo boats, but to attack the enemy battle fleet offensively with torpedoes themselves. Meanwhile, the German Navy, under Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, had mirrored British destroyer developments. Though German destroyers were generally smaller, they were still tough and versatile, and every bit as capable of operating with their main battle fleet as British destroyers. Soon, the destroyers on both sides would get their chance to demonstrate their abilities in combat. August 1914. As World War I began, the British and Germans both believed that a great and decisive naval battle between their main fleets of dreadnought battleships would occur almost immediately. But for a variety of reasons, this didn't happen. And the war in the North Sea largely became a contest between smaller warships like the destroyer. In clash after clash, destroyers laid mines off each other's bases, bombarded enemy ports and troop concentrations, and shot and torpedoed each other at every opportunity. Then in May of 1916, the long-awaited Battle of Main Fleets finally took place. When the British Grand Fleet and German High Seas Fleet collided off Jutland, the 61 German and 78 British destroyers were an important part of the engagement from the beginning. At first, they fought each other in a vain attempt to bring their deadly torpedoes within range of the other side's dreadnoughts. After withdrawing to regroup, the British destroyers charged in ahead of their dreadnoughts to face the entire German fleet alone, running into murderous fire. Several of them were left sinking, and HMS Turbulent was literally blown out of the water. But the rest of the British destroyers pressed home their torpedo attacks and succeeded in sinking 2 German light cruisers and the German battleship Pommern. Later in the battle, with his fleet badly battered by the British dreadnoughts, the German commander, Admiral Reinhard Scheer, made a desperate attempt to save his ships by ordering them to execute a complex turning maneuver. To cover their escape, he sent nearly 50 of his destroyers in to launch a torpedo attack on the British fleet. The little German ships charged through the gathering dusk, water surging over their bows as they steered toward the enemy's ships. Ahead lay the over 24 dreadnoughts of the British Grand Fleet, the largest concentration of battleships in history, and they were unleashing a furious barrage on their German attackers. As each German destroyer came within the 7,500-yard range of its torpedoes, it wheeled and fired, then sped for safety. Many of them were sunk, but fearing their lethal torpedoes, the British dreadnoughts turned away, allowing the rest of the German fleet to evade destruction. Destroyers had proven that they could play an important role in a major battle. They were now an indispensable element of the fleet. But a type of warship called the submarine, which had just become a practical weapon in the early 1900s, would soon give destroyers a vital new role.
When the German U-boats hit the scene, everybody said, oh, this is a serious weapon. We needed an escort for the heavies, for the battleships and the cruisers. What better than the destroyer, which was already there as an escort counter to the surface torpedo ship, and now it could pick up as the defender against the underwater torpedo carrier.
On December 4th, 1916, HMS Llewellyn became the first destroyer to sink a submarine with depth charges, an ingenious underwater weapon that had only recently been added to the destroyer's growing arsenal.
Depth charges were developed in World War I, and they were called ash cans for very obvious reasons. They looked like, essentially, metal drums. And so somebody said, well, why don't we take an explosive, put it in a container, put a hydrostatic fuse on it, that is one that's operated by pressure, and roll it off the stern.
It was extremely difficult to hit a submerged submarine this way. But the destroyer men used a variety of creative techniques to increase their chances of success.
Once a submarine fires, it's no longer invisible. You see this line of a torpedo going towards you. A destroyer is fast enough to run back down that line to roughly where the submarine has to be. You can then pepper that area with depth charges, hoping that one will be close enough to kill the sub. And in fact, amazingly enough, that works a lot of the time.
Though less glamorous than fleet duty, protecting vital convoys of troops and supplies from the undersea menace of the submarine was every bit as important. With their speed and maneuverability, destroyers soon became the mainstays of this effort. But British destroyers were stretched to the limit by fleet work, and everyone taken for convoy escort duty would leave a hole in the battle line. Then, America entered the war. On April 14, 1917, 6 U.S. Navy destroyers left American waters for Europe to help guard the convoys. Eventually, 273 U.S. destroyers would see service. Mainly the famous Four Pipers, so named because of their distinctive quartet of smokestacks. These destroyers were among the hundreds that were mass-produced by both sides during the war. Sliding into the water like Model Ts off an assembly line, the American Four Pipers were instrumental in breaking the strangling German submarine blockade of England and bringing an end to World War I. During the war, destroyers had evolved from being small, specialized warships into vessels capable of fulfilling a variety of roles. Now, the subtle pressures of peace and another global war would bring further changes in destroyer design and tactics. The end of World War I brought worldwide naval cutbacks. As hundreds of ships were scrapped or stored, the days of the mass-produced destroyers seemed to be over. New ships were built in smaller batches, with designs stressing utility and versatility even more than in the past. Increased amenities for the crews also became more important as the destroyers undertook longer voyages to fulfill the duties traditionally undertaken by other types of ships. The first of these began to appear at the end of the 1920s. The British began with the so-called A to I class destroyers, handsome two-funneled vessels with 4 4.7-inch guns, 8 torpedo tubes, and a speed of 30 knots. The Americans, who still possessed a huge number of surplus Four Pipers, didn't feel the same sense of urgency about updating their destroyer fleet. When they finally began adding new classes in 1932, they started with the Farragut's, ships similar to the British A to I's. Yet even before these new ships took to the water, the Japanese had made a tremendous advance in destroyer design when they produced the magnificent Fubuki class. First built in the late 1920s, the Fubukis were 390 feet long, displaced 1,750 tons, and had a top speed approaching 38 knots. 3 twin 5-inch guns in completely enclosed mounts could also be elevated high enough to fight off attacking aircraft. But the Japanese ace in the hole, and a carefully guarded secret, was their deadly new torpedo.
The Japanese had thought very carefully about equalizers. Sometime in the 1930s, the Japanese realized they could never match the United States Navy. They estimated that by 1941-42, we would have such superiority that they couldn't match us in numbers. So they decided to do something qualitative. They developed, among other things, an equalizer in the form of a very large torpedo called Long Lance.
These superb weapons could travel at 42 knots for over 15 miles, both farther and faster than any other torpedo in the world.
And the Long Lance was a murderous weapon. It was a much bigger torpedo than ours, and a terribly accurate weapon, and the Japanese had trained hard in its use.
The Long Lance would give Japanese destroyers like the Fubuki class a significant advantage in battle. But before that advantage was actually tested, their future adversaries were forced to face an older opponent. On September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland, once again plunging Europe into war. At sea, they immediately began using their submarines in an attempt to starve England into submission. Just as in World War I, British destroyers played a major role in England's defense, helping to escort the convoys of merchant ships that were Britain's lifeline. But their numbers soon proved to be insufficient. even after 50 American four-pipers were transferred to the Royal Navy under a program called Lend-Lease. Then in December 1941, America entered the war. After a period of adjustment, U.S. destroyers played a vital role in the anti-submarine campaign. Aided by sonar, a British invention that used waves of sound to detect submerged submarines by echolocation, improved depth charges, and an even more potent anti-submarine weapon called the Hedgehog mortar, which fired a pattern of underwater bomblets at an enemy sub, they were instrumental in turning the tide against the German U-boats.
A Hedgehog was a head-thrown weapon whose launching facility was a rectangular area with a bunch of, well, we called them spigots, a bunch of spikes that stuck up like this. So they reminded people of a hedgehog or a porcupine.
One of the most significant advantages of the Hedgehog was that, unlike depth charges, they only exploded on contact with an enemy submarine.
If you missed, you missed. Unlike the depth charges, which went off when they reached depth, no matter if anybody was around or not. This way you knew whether you were on target or not.
Even as they were once again helping to save Britain from defeat, American destroyers were proving their mettle on the other side of the world as well, against the potent destroyers of the Japanese Navy. November 1943. Captain Arleigh Burke's destroyer Squadron 23 was heading up the channel in the Solomon Islands known as the Spot. Burke's colorful nickname of 31 Knot was matched by that of his squadron, who were called the Little Beavers because they would take on any sort of job, and did all of them well. Tonight, they were heading to intercept the latest installment of the Tokyo Express, a long-running Japanese effort to resupply their island garrisons in the area by using their warships to transport troops and supplies. Tipped off by intercepted Japanese radio messages, Burke knew that the latest mission would be carried out by Japanese destroyers. Despite their fierce reputation, Burke was confident of success, a confidence that was bolstered by the quality of his ships. All five were of the Fletcher class, perhaps the finest all-around destroyers of World War II.
Why we developed the Fletcher class destroyer is because we saw the potential of war in the Pacific, and we wanted destroyers with longer legs, that is, greater range than we were building. Pre-World War II classes like the Benson and the Liverwars were adequate destroyers as destroyers in the main went in those days. But they wouldn't operate successfully in the Pacific because the Pacific was 7,000 miles across.
With a length of 376 feet and a displacement of 2,150 tons, the Fletchers carried 5 5-inch guns in enclosed mounts, 10 torpedo tubes in 2 rotating mounts, an anti-aircraft battery of 40 and 20-millimeter guns, and depth charges. With a top speed of 38 knots, they were an extremely formidable fighting package.
The Fletchers were really quite competitive. The Japanese had an edge to start with because, of course, they'd initiated the war, and the Fletchers were just in the building phase when the war began. So we were 6 months into the war before the Fletchers got active, and we had a little bit of a learning curve. But when you stack them up equipment-wise, speed-wise, things like that, they were very competitive.
Facing Burke's squadron was a mixed bag of Japanese destroyers, 2 of which belonged to the legendary Fubuki class. The Japanese commander was depending on the superior Japanese night binoculars and his deadly long-lance torpedoes to help achieve victory if the Americans arrived. But American destroyers now carried an advance the Japanese lacked: radar. By enabling U.S. ships to detect enemy vessels at extremely long distances, radar gave the Americans a significant advantage in battle, particularly at night. U.S. naval commanders had also become highly skilled at processing the information they gathered with their radar.
The U.S. Navy had learned much more about radar. In particular, what we learned was that it wasn't enough just to have a snapshot of what was happening around you. What you had to have was a continuing picture provided by radar, so that successive detections had to be connected together. You did that in a place called the Combat Information Center, CIC. And you find that early in '43, all of the destroyers in the Solomons are fitted with CICs. Once they have CICs, the situation changes very rapidly. That makes it possible for a destroyer commander to watch the progress of an action at night.
The Japanese ships had already delivered their supplies and were returning to base when Burke's destroyers picked them up on radar. Burke quickly decided to launch a torpedo attack before the enemy realized they'd been spotted. At just before 2 a.m., the American ships launched 15 torpedoes at the still unsuspecting enemy. Moments later, 2 Japanese destroyers were hit, sending them both to the bottom.
When he launched his torpedo attacks, he withheld his gunfire. So there was no clue. There was no announcement, no bang and flash out there at the same time the torpedoes were launched. So the Japanese didn't know they were coming. And since the Japanese had no radar, they didn't know the American ships were laying there.
The commander of the remaining Japanese ships decided to make a run for it. Burke pursued. But he knew that the surviving enemy vessels and their long lance torpedoes were still dangerous. Suddenly, he ordered a high-speed turn to the right. As he did, 3 torpedoes from one of the Fubuki-class destroyers narrowly missed the stern of his ship. Burke's reasoned hunch had saved his vessel. He then continued the pursuit, destroying one of the Fubukis with gunfire before deciding to withdraw. By sinking 3 of 5 enemy ships while losing none of his own, Burke had won a smashing victory at the Battle of Cape St. George, a victory that decisively demonstrated the superiority of his leadership and his destroyers. American commanders like Arleigh Burke and improved ships like the Fletchers were helping to turn the tide in the Pacific. But the Japanese were not finished yet. They would soon devise another deadly threat that would give American destroyers perhaps their severest test: the kamikaze. But first, destroyers would play a vital role in one of the most epical battles of World War II, the invasion of Europe called D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched their long-awaited invasion of the German-held coast of France. Codenamed Overlord, it was the greatest amphibious landing in the history of warfare. After air attacks involving over 10,000 bombers and fighters, 2,300 transport planes dropped 3 airborne divisions on the ground as anchors for the coming invasion. It then fell upon 1,200 transports and 4,000 landing craft, escorted by nearly 900 major warships, to land 5 infantry divisions on the beach. This was Operation Neptune, the naval component of Overlord. Among those warships were 145 destroyers. They were responsible for convoy escort, protecting the ships crowded off the beach from German submarines, torpedo boats, and aircraft, and helping to bombard the beaches before the invasion.
In an amphibious assault, a destroyer's multi-purpose capabilities rarely come into being, because at the outset you'll have destroyers escorting the amphibious assault force across to the target area. Once they get to the target area, you'll have destroyers that will set up an anti-submarine barrier outside the objective area so that the amphibious ships can operate relatively immune from that problem.
As the Pacific was putting heavy demands on the Fletchers and their newer sisters, many of the American destroyers at Normandy were of the older Benson and Livermore classes, maneuverable fleet boats that were just coming into service at the beginning of the war. One of the most important jobs of destroyers like these was direct gunfire support for the invading troops. While battleships and cruisers hit the beaches with heavy fire from far offshore, the smaller destroyers were designated to get in closer and respond directly to the needs of the men on the ground.
After the troops are ashore, you'll actually have a destroyer assigned to each Marine battalion. And they have a communications link, and the Marines can say, I want a shot here. And I do mean here, not in this area, but right here. And the accuracy of the naval guns were such that they could put them right there, not necessarily on the first shot, but certainly within 3 or 4, and destroy the target, whether it was stationary or moving.
But getting in close enough to put 5-inch shells on German bunkers meant putting your ship at risk from mines and enemy gunfire. On June 8th, that risk became painfully obvious when the destroyers Meredith and Glennon hit mines and sank. The destroyer escort Rich, coming to the Glennon's aid, hit 2 more mines and broke in half. A total of 149 sailors were lost. Despite these sinkings, Allied destroyers did a valiant job throughout the landings, helping to turn them into a resounding success. Then in August, the Germans turned to a desperate new strategy. On the night of August 2nd, 58 midget submarines armed with a single torpedo each set out to attack the ships crowded off the Normandy beachhead. They sank one British destroyer, a trawler, and a landing craft. 41 midget subs were destroyed along with most of their crews. For the Germans manning these weapons, it was a costly, almost suicidal effort. One that would soon be mirrored half a world away. On October 25, 1944, the aircraft carrier St. Lo was hit by a Japanese suicide aircraft. 35 minutes later, racked by explosions, she sank. A new and horrible weapon had come to the Pacific: the kamikazes.
Even now, if you read accounts of attack by kamikazes, the idea that the attacker wants to die is terrifying.
Japanese power had been collapsing for 2 years, but there was no shortage of Japanese courage. A special corps of pilots, many with only rudimentary training, was formed with the purpose of turning aircraft into one-way bombs. These so-called brave eagles of Japan would crash their planes into American ships, destroying them and turning back the anticipated invasion of Japan. American commanders responded by surrounding their fleets with pickets, groups of radar-equipped destroyers whose job was to detect the kamikazes at the longest distances possible, then guide U.S. fighters in to intercept. Due to the radar pickets' extreme importance for the defense of the American fleet, the kamikazes attacked them with particular ferocity.
And so they literally rained hundreds of these attacking aircraft with their human guidance systems against the destroyers, and it was a bloody, bloody, bloody time.
The American destroyer, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, would throw up a curtain of fire, trying to knock the planes down or kill their hell-bent pilots. The Japanese flyers would hold to their purpose, trusting to luck and a fanatical devotion to duty and emperor. If the plane struck its target, the resulting explosion could tear open a hull, explode a magazine, and slaughter the destroyermen fighting to defend their fleet. It was the destroyer's greatest challenge and their finest hour. On November 1st, 1944, the Abner Reed became the first destroyer to be lost to a kamikaze. On December 7th, the Ward, which had fired the first American shot at Pearl Harbor, was hit and sunk exactly 3 years later to the day. In the months that followed, several more destroyers were lost to kamikazes. Then on March 26, 1945, the last major amphibious campaign of the war began at an island that few Americans had ever heard of: Okinawa. On April 6th, mass kamikaze attacks on the U.S. invasion fleet began. 6 destroyers were either sunk or turned into floating wreckage on the first day. But the American destroyers and their crews were also developing tactics that would help them combat the Japanese suicide planes.
You did basically 2 things. First of all, you tried and turned your ship broadside to the direction from which he was coming. And then you wanted to put as much lead in the air as you could get up there. If you could hit him with it, fine. But it would work just as well if he ran into it.
On the morning of April 16, 1945, an American destroyer named the Laffey was put to the ultimate test during an epic confrontation with the kamikazes. The Laffey was on radar picket duty when she was spotted by 50 Japanese aircraft. 22 managed to break through the defending U.S. fighters and make attacks on the ship. Of these, gunners on the Laffey shot down 8, but the Japanese assaults were relentless. Altogether, the Laffey was hit by 7 kamikazes. She was also struck by 4 bombs and strafed repeatedly. She suffered 31 killed and 72 wounded, yet somehow managed to survive. Repaired, she served until 1977, when she became a war memorial in Charleston, South Carolina. The cost of the Okinawa campaign for U.S. destroyers was steep. 16 sunk and 139 damaged. Over 800 destroyermen were killed and 1,500 wounded. But the rugged American destroyers had performed every job that was assigned to them, from radar picket and anti-submarine patrol to shore bombardment, and were instrumental in helping to turn Okinawa into a hard-fought victory. It was the last great battle of World War II, and for destroyers, the end of a generation. Just as at the end of World War I, the close of World War II brought new challenges for the destroyer. The losing navies were gone, and the winners had far too many ships. Destroyers were put in storage, scrapped, or in the case of many American ships, sold to dozens of smaller navies around the world. But a new adversary, the Soviet Union, was coming on the scene, and the roles of destroyers would have to adapt once again to meet the new threat. During the years of mostly uneasy peace called the Cold War, the seas became more dangerous than ever before. Jet aircraft, flying from land bases and carriers, replaced the less capable propeller-driven planes. Shipborne radar was improved and augmented by satellites and systems carried by aircraft. The anti-ship missile replaced the torpedo. And diesel-powered submarines gave way to faster, deeper-diving nuclear models, intent on owning the seas from below.
The big difference is that in the 1950s, the submarines got nuclear power. And with the coming of nuclear power, they got a virtually unlimited power source. The hull shapes changed, the power went up, their speeds went up enormously. There are submarines today that do more than 40 knots.
Despite the growing challenges, when the Cold War grew hot, American destroyers answered the call, serving with distinction in Korea and Vietnam by performing every role from escort duty to shore bombardment. Meanwhile, destroyers were growing larger and more capable, as designers all over the world added new weapons and electronics. Between 1959 and 1964, 131 World War II destroyers were rebuilt to carry remotely controlled drone anti-submarine helicopters, or DASH units, that carried anti-submarine torpedoes. They were a failure, but the idea of combining anti-submarine helicopters with destroyers was firmly established.
The Combat Information Center on the destroyer will integrate all its information on where the submarine is and what it's doing, and will send its helicopter out to drop the torpedo virtually right above where the submarine is.
The anti-ship missile was also pioneered for use on destroyers, first by the Swedes and then by the Russians. By the 1970s, destroyer designers had incorporated most of these innovations into their latest ships. In the U.S. Navy, the result was the formidable Spruance class. At a displacement of 7,800 tons, these destroyers were bigger than many World War II cruisers. Yet powered by 4 modern gas turbines, they could still reach speeds of well over 30 knots, making them nearly as fast as the much smaller Fletchers and Fubukis. Amazingly, these capabilities were actually increased in the Arleigh Burke class. These remarkable vessels were originally planned as a complement to the Ticonderoga class cruisers, as an escort ship for the massive nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that are the core of the U.S. Navy's surface fleet. In this role, the Arleigh Burke's primary missions are to protect the carrier from attack by aircraft, cruise missiles, and submarines.
The traditional role of the destroyer has always been to be bold and aggressive, to carry the fight to the enemy, to chase submarines and provide fast escort for carrier task forces or amphibious forces.
One of the main features that allows the Arleigh Burkes to fulfill the air defense portion of this assignment is their sophisticated Aegis radar system. The Aegis's most visible characteristics is a series of fixed hexagonal antennas that are mounted on the ship's superstructure. Called phased arrays, they aim the radar beams at their targets electronically rather than mechanically, as in the more familiar rotating dish-style antennas carried by earlier destroyers. Linked to a state-of-the-art computerized data processing system, the Aegis can be used by crewmen in the destroyer's Combat Information Center, deep inside the ship, to track dozens of targets at the same time. They can then launch several missiles to simultaneously attack aircraft or cruise missiles at distances of up to 40 miles and altitudes ranging from almost 20 miles high to a few feet off the water.
The radar will scan the horizon once every 2 seconds. It will scan out to 256 miles every 20 seconds. And we can build into the system artificial intelligence or a reasoning capability that says if a missile is flying at this altitude, at this speed, then launch. And the system, in a hands-off mode from the operator, will detect, will track, assign a missile, and shoot it within 5 seconds. And this ship can launch a missile upwards of 100,000 feet in altitude and intercept a target flying Mach 5.
These missiles are housed in 2 groups of vertical launch cells at the fore and aft ends of the ship. The twin vertical launch systems can carry up to 90 weapons, including surface-to-air missiles, Tomahawk surface-to-surface cruise missiles, and ASROC anti-submarine rockets. The powerful anti-submarine capability of the Arleigh Burkes is anchored by its 2 sonar systems. An active sonar seeks its target by using waves of sound. The passive array is a series of sensitive microphones mounted in a rubberized cable that is towed behind the ship to listen for the telltale sounds made by submerged subs.
The traditional way that we have fought submarines has been with depth charges and over-the-side torpedoes fired in close. Today, with the advances in the submarine technology, its speed, its depth, its quietness, we have to keep the submarine in arm's reach. We fired torpedoes from our own vertical launch system that are rocket propelled, that come out of the launcher, will fly downrange 8 to 10 miles and fall on top of the submarine and drop a torpedo right on it.
Despite its missiles and space-age electronics, the designers of the Arleigh Burkes didn't neglect the virtues of old-fashioned gunpowder. The 5-inch gun carried in a forward mount has an automated reloading system that can achieve rates of fire of up to 20 rounds per minute. And any destroyer commander at Okinawa would have given his eye teeth for the Phalanx close-in weapon system, a rapid-firing 20mm cannon designed to shoot down sea-skimming anti-ship missiles.
It fires over 3,000 rounds a minute. It's a fully automatic gun. It throws up a wall of lead that takes that missile as it comes in, tracks both the bullets and the target, steers the bullets onto the target, and knocks down the missile as a last-ditch defense.
No doubt, the imposing capabilities of the Arleigh Burkes would have impressed Jackie Fisher. With their combination of helicopters, anti-ship and anti-aircraft missiles, each of them is more powerful than a whole squadron of World War I dreadnoughts. Yet they still have the speed and elan that Fisher craved in all his warships. Indeed, they are a fitting tribute not only to him, but to the heroic legacy of Arleigh Burke. Admiral Burke himself survived long enough to christen his namesake. Though long retired, he was still as feisty as ever. During his speech, he growled to her assembled crewmen, "This ship was built to fight. You had better know how." Perhaps no single phrase better sums up the purpose and character of these splendid vessels. From stem to stern, they are fighting ships, born and bred for combat. Even though they have evolved extensively over the years, their essence remains intact. From Jutland to the Atlantic convoys and Cape St. George, from D-Day and Okinawa to the Cold War and beyond, their bold spirit still sails on.